Jill smiled and took a last bite of her after-dinner candy. Like the confections from the Demel pastry shop, the story of her husband's failed romance with his student was a Viennese bonbon, sweet chocolate on the outside, concealing perhaps a bittersweet surprise in the heart. It will never replace a full meal prepared by an expert.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Edmonds, and I'm the editor-in-chief of For Page and Screen magazine. I'm here today with Matias Travieso-Diaz, author of A Viennese Bonbon, which we had the honor of publishing in our sixth issue, published back in 2024. Thank you so much for being here with me today.
I appreciate your having me.
Yeah, I'm excited. This is the second time we've done an interview, so I'm excited to hear what's changed, hear what's new. But to start out, as always, I want to talk about the story first. So, can you tell me a little bit about what inspired this piece?
Well, this story has a very interesting backstory. I need to give you some background. I am very meticulous in keeping a list of all my stories as I write them and numbering them. So one to whatever, I'm up to 198, but in terms of number. But the one just exactly before a Viennese bonbon was number 96. It's a grim science fiction futuristic story about the totalitarian government efforts to control the minds of its citizens. When I finished writing that, it went very well, but that's I said I had to do something very different. And the different thing was that how I love stories. You know from our talk last year that I love short love stories. And in fact, I'm having a collection of my some of my love stories published hopefully sometime later this year. Then I said I'm going to do a love story. It's going to be number 97 on my list. But number 97 for me is a number that has a very, very unique connotation. 97 is the opus number of Beethoven's Trio for Piano, Archduke Trio, which is one of his most sublime works. People probably think of Beethoven as a classical composer, but he was the first great romantic composer. And the music is very romantic, it's very tempestuous, and it's a dialogue between the violin, the cello, and the piano. I said, I have to write something that sounds like that. So I tailor my story to the four movements of that trio. And in fact, you read the story, you see the markings that show the tempi and the order of things. And each part of the story has more or less the same character as the music that is supposed to be listened to while you play. Anyhow, it went well in that respect. I knew what I wanted to write, but the question is what the story was going to be about, and no less importantly, where do I place it? I have been in Austria in 1979, just before I met my wife. And in fact, she and I were thinking of having a trip to Europe the year that she fell ill and died. So we never did it. But I still had that destination in mind. And one of the points that was a highlight of my trip in 79 was a very tiny village in Austria near Salzburg on the lakes called Hallstatt. It is a very small town, but it's beautiful. The buildings date back to the Renaissance and they are gorgeous. All buildings are bedecked with flowers in the summer. It's a great place to go in the summer. Anyhow, so I had now the setting and the kind of story and the music that go along with it. So it almost wrote itself because what was going to happen? The story is about a piano, the composer, that is all accomplished, a famous man, and his wife who plays the cello, is a very smart, savvy, and worldwide woman, and a bubbly 17-year-old girl who is a student who plays the violin. Okay, so the story would evolve into a failed romance between the composer and his student, and the wife wisely endured it and lived through it, and that's what it's all about. And that's how it came to be the Viennese bonbon.
You actually answered one of my follow-up questions already. I was curious about the musical, the tempo notations throughout the story. I love them because they add another layer of depth and kind of almost foreshadowing if to people who know the music already or know musical notation. That adds a whole other level to it. I love that element of it.
Well, for anybody who has the ability and they see this video and the ability to listen to the music, that trio by Beethoven is one of the greatest works of any kind. And as far as the mood of the music, it is, as I said, it's supposed to be something like a romance because of the markings tell you that. And it just drove me to write it exactly as it came out. So this was one of the easiest stories to write once I got the idea because the music and the setting all conspire to make it just flow the way it is.
Mhm. Absolutely. And it flows very well. I love the character dynamic specifically between the composer and his wife. Because his wife knows something's going on and she's trying to give him like these nudges like you can't keep up, you need to take it easy, you need to rest, all of these things, and he just powers through. And it's interesting to see that dynamic play out.
Well, I have to tell you, my favorite part of the story within the story is in the third moment when the wife realizes that something's going on. She's trying to decide what to do. Okay, and she's debating whether to confront her husband or confront the student, do something, and then realize what woman that he is, that she better hold her tongue and let it play out and hope for the best, which is what happened.
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
had great pleasure writing that part and thinking about how what would if I were an enduring wife with a husband that ran around, how would I handle it? And I tried to write it the way that I would handle it if I were her too.
Mhm.
And I think as you can see, it worked out well.
Yeah, I like the way it plays out. I think it's an interesting take because we think of, or I think of at least, stories with affairs, and there's this big blow up and people are screaming, and I'm absolutely sure that happens. But also, it feels realistic to kind of just be like, okay, how is this going to play out? Let me see. Let me kind of step back and watch it self-destruct, so to speak. See if he comes back, that kind of thing.
Well, in the context, remember the wife is in her 50s
Mhm.
and her husband is about the same age, a little older. And there isn't very much he can really do to compete in terms of fighting. He has to make hope that the husband will come to his senses or that events will take care of themselves as they do. And if that's what makes it wise.
Mhm. Mhm. Definitely, definitely. Now, I'm curious, you had mentioned being inspired by the desire to write romance as well as by the music. Do you often, I probably asked you this last time, but I'm asking a variation. Um, do you often pull inspiration specifically from genres or from places, music, etc.? Where do you generally find your inspiration for your stories?
The answer is yes. All about. In fact, my one of my best recent stories that just got published is called Symphony in A minor, based on Mahler's Sixth Symphony. And it is, I don't know, I won't go to describe it, but I think it is a very important story for people to read in this day and age because it's very contemporary. Okay. And I wrote it with that particular piece of music in mind. I written three or four things along the same line, but this one is the most recent example. And Viennese Bonbon, of course, it was directly inspired by Beethoven's music. But all of my stories draw inspiration for particular places I have been to. Like I have a story that is set, a horror story, but an interesting horror story that is set forth in set up in an abandoned village in the southern Italy, where I went once, and it was a very imposing place and perfect place for a horror story. And I wrote it based on that. So I mean, that's what I do. I get inspiration from wherever it comes, and often local, often music, often other works of literature that I write. Uh, I just wrote another story that got published recently about a restaging of Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker Ballet, and with taking advantage of the political situation contemporaneously and the fact that there is an epic fight in the ballet that is perfect for the story we're going to write. So, as I said, I draw my inspiration from many sources.
I love that. I love that. And I love the way you can kind of pull in like different layers and Easter eggs in the story based on that inspiration. Who's someone who knows the city or knows the music or knows the story outside of the story can kind of see that and kind of pull it through and get that deeper meaning out of it. I think that's fantastic.
Yeah. Well, you remember that I try to be very realistic in the stories that I write, trying to be faithful to whatever it is, the locale or the events or whatever. So, like this one here, I try to be faithful to Hallstatt and to the fact that it's an ideal place to have a romance and an ideal place to have the kind of problem that the composer gets into and so on. So, what I did, I have been to the town, but I did some research on it before I wrote the story.
Yeah, and I think that comes across really well. I've never been anywhere in Austria, but the setting descriptions, the way you kind of set the scene works incredibly well to make the reader feel immersed in the town, in the place, in the romance of it all. How do you go about writing settings? Your settings are very immersive, so I'm curious if you have like a tip or advice for someone trying to build immersive settings in the story.
Well, it's a simple formula. Become familiar with what you're writing about. If you become sufficiently familiar with the topic, and especially if it's a locale, it will write itself. I mean, Hallstatt is a very little but very picturesque town, has a beautiful hotel where the story takes place, a great view of the lake, and you can see it behind it. And, if you do your research and get familiar with the locale, describing is not a problem. It's not really a problem. Now, if it is a fantastic story that also has a particular place, the difficulty is different. I'm trying to imagine something that doesn't exist. But when you have something particularly existing in mind, it's very easy.
Definitely. Now, you do also write kind of fantastical stories, genre fiction, sci-fi. Do you have a preference as to what genre you like to work in?
Well, I keep on debating. Of course, I do have, I must say that I have preferences among my stories. Some of my stories I love more than others, even though I shouldn't say. But among genres, I gravitate from one to the other depending on what ideas come to me. I have written many horror stories, two books of them. I have written many fantasy stories, one book of it. I have written heroic fiction, one book of it, and I have written, of course, animal stories, which I would like to get published. I have written 2 dozen of them, and they're one of my favorites. And I have written alternative history, which is one of a genre that I love because it gives me a chance to take an event or a series of events in history and ask myself, what if one of the pieces in the puzzle have been changed? What if Napoleon had won Waterloo, for example? Okay, I haven't written that one, but it's a kind of you kind of it's sort of a fantasy, but again, it has to be meticulously written based on true historical facts. I think last year we were talking about a story I was writing, and I got finished shortly after we talked about the German wars of religion in the 1700s, in the 1600s, and I had to bend out the history a little bit, but I came up with something that was really pretty good. I'm not trying to be bragging about it, but it was. But again, the same thing. You have to be rigorous in using the whatever tools you are at your disposal, making sure you're faithful to what your starting point is, and then you can depart from it.
That sounds really complicated to do, honestly, being able to actively change some elements of history while maintaining the integrity of the actual time period and the tone and everything.
Well, some of it is very easy, but no, never is very easy. Sometimes it's easier than others because it's relatively easy to predict what would happen if A had changed to B. To give you an example, one of my first alternate history stories that I wrote, one of the better ones, it has been repeated a couple of times, is there was a Tsar, Alexander II, in the late 1800s, who was very progressive and was trying to bring Russia into the 20th century, late 19th century, and liberate the Serbs and so on. Was very progressive man with great future for Russia. The man got killed in a terrorist attack by a band of radicals. So my story is why if he hadn't died. If he hadn't died, there would not have been an October Revolution. The communists would have taken over, and the world would be totally different today. So that one was easy to write if you can linearly predict with some accuracy what could have happened. Not that it would have, but what could have. Some of the things are more speculative because the farther back in history you go, the more things can diverge. So it becomes more of a gambling game. But if you were another story, for example, that I wrote on the same line was about uh, there was a point after the First World War that the world was getting to create a League of Nations that was intended to have all countries be part of it and bound by it, and we have avoided the wars. The U.S. did not join uh, in that effort, which Woodrow Wilson was the main instigator, because the Republican opposition didn't want they wanted to keep the U.S. in an isolationist stance, pretty much the same way they are today. And because of that, in fact, the League of Nations was formed, but it was totally and without the U.S. they had no teeth. If it had been in existence, there might have never been the Nazis coming to power in Germany and so on. So I write the story with what if Woodrow Wilson had managed to get that thing over to take place, the League of Nations to come in, and what would have been the world like today? That was relatively easy to write. It requires too much extrapolation.
Definitely. They all sound like fascinating stories. Um, always talking with you always makes me want to read all of these different stories um, that you have
Well,
written.
tell me what you want, and I'll send it to you. I also have many of them reprinted on my webpage.
Mhm.
So if you will add my webpage to this to the recording of this interview, people will welcome to go and read those stories that I'm talking about. They're all there.
Yeah, definitely. We will put the link to that in the little description under this interview so everyone can find it. Um, and speaking of your publications, I recently noticed that you published an autobiography, and that's fantastic. And I would love to talk about that if that's okay.
Well, of course, yes. Actually, my daughter sitting behind me today is the culprit. It all started out by we adopted her from Russia when she was a little girl, and she asked me one day, "How did you and your mommy meet?" And I had never written a story or told a story about how I met my wife, and I wrote a short story about it for her. And that short story grew into a series of other personal vignettes having to do with how I left Cuba, how I became a lawyer, etc., and so forth. And I'm looking at them all together and said, well, I could make a book out of it. It was not intended to start with writing an autobiography from A to Z, but it accumulated with all these stories, and it made a pretty decent whole. And this is my life. If you want to know about it, it's all there. It's called Cuban Transplant. It's available on Amazon if you want to read.
Definitely. And we can link that as well. We will include all of the links.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I love that. I was going to ask you how it came about, so I love that story. I feel like, I don't know, it can be hard. I imagine it's hard to kind of take that leap and write about yourself in a personal way. Did you find that difficult at all?
Some parts were harder. The part that was the hardest to write, even today, describing my wife's illness
Mhm.
and her death, that was very hard to write.
Mhm.
Not technically, just emotionally.
Mhm.
Some things are very easy. I mean, the story how I left Cuba, I'm fascinated by it myself because it was such a concatenation of uh, circumstances that were totally fortuitous that got me here. So that one I was easy to write and I enjoyed writing it. But some are hard,
Mhm.
some were hard.
Mhm.
But it
Absolutely.
was not technically it wasn't that difficult to write. But emotionally, getting to bring myself to write about those some of the things, I mean, was hard.
Understandably, for sure. I'm sure that everyone who reads it, though, will kind of feel that emotion in the story as well. Everyone, I'm sure, will feel that too.
Well, people who have read the story and written reviews of it, good reviews, one of them really said that, I read it in one day, I couldn't put it down. And at the end, I was kind of floored by the level of emotion because I wasn't pulling anything that wasn't right there. I mean, it was just I wasn't being really creative in the sense of creating fantasy. I was just talking from my mind, from my recollection, my experiences, my feelings, and it was not hard to write as a whole. Some parts of it, as I said, were much harder than
Do you frequently write nonfiction like that, or was that kind of your first foray into this?
depending on what you mean by nonfiction, because everybody's life is a work of fiction of some kind.
Yeah.
But if you are talking about, do I usually try to write things that are not in any way artistic or fantastic? Um, I've written much of that, of course, as a lawyer, as an engineer. I wrote many things. For my dissertation, you don't find anything having to do with any of the things we're talking about today. But in reality, I have written very few essays aside from, and one of them actually found its way into my autobiography as to what drew me to become a writer and how I operate when I write and so on. And I guess you can consider that to be nonfiction because it is nonfiction, even though it deals with the creation of fiction. So, but for the most part, I don't write. I've written many nonfictional works in my prior life as an engineer and lawyer. But since I became a writer for pleasure, you will, I've written very little that it is directly nonfiction. I mean, not directly.
No, that makes sense, definitely. Um, and do you find, or do you think you'll publish more kind of memoirs or more essays like that in the future?
Well, if there is a second edition of my autobiography, if I live long enough to write a second edition, there are two or three more things that I could add that have happened since, or that amplify the things that I say. But I know I'm not envisioning doing that now. It could happen, but
Hmm.
look, I'm 82 years old. I don't know how much longer I'm going to be in the game, and how much longer I'm going to be able to be writing things. So it may very well be that that's it. That's all she wrote. But it's possible that in 3 or 4 years I'm still around. If there is a second edition of my autobiography, I will augment it with a couple more things that have transpired since.
Definitely. Well, I hope that there's a second edition in the future. That would be fantastic.
I made no promises to anybody,
Yes, no worries. No worries.
but if there is time and there are things to say, and there is a willingness of publisher to put them out, I don't mind doing it.
Mhm.
And my life at this point is an open book. Boring reading, but an open book.
Don't say that. No one's life is boring, not in my opinion. Um, I would love to talk about the publication process for the book, if that's okay. Kind of how did you get that out there? What did it look like going through that process?
Well, I have to tell you, getting a book published is very hard. People who have written stuff thinking to getting a novel or whatever published better have a strong stomach and a lot of patience. This actually was so easy; it's almost a work of destiny. It so happened that I had written a story that dealt with my years, the year that I arrived in Columbus, Ohio, back in 1967, 68, to go get my PhD. And I wrote a story about, of course, I was Cuban born, living in Miami, which was like living in Cuba for 3 or 4 years, and being extracted from Miami and ended up in Ohio, in the middle of the Midwest, a totally different culture. I was had a lot of trouble adapting to it. And I wrote a story about the way became, I started to become acclimatized to being in the Midwest, which was the time I went to see the Ohio State Michigan football game in 1968. Okay? And it's a story, in fact, that was published by a magazine, and the editor was actually a football fan, and he liked it very much. And he says, "What else do you have? Have you written anything personal?" And I said, "Well, I have a series of things that I could sell autobiographical. Let me put them together." And I put them together and sent it to him. I said, "Well, this is great. Let me just publish it for you." And I said, "Oh my God," that was not in my imagination at all. And we worked pretty closely. He made me add some stuff. He made me explain some things. And I thought what came out was pretty good, but it was essentially something that was there for the picking, but not nothing that I was intended to do. So that's how it came, how the process of publishing my autobiography came about. And as I said, it was very serendipitous. It was not some of the other things that I have been publishing and trying to publish have been much harder. My short stories are usually go. The collections have been going fairly easily. But the other two novels, I'm working on fourth. The first two novels were very hard. I haven't been able to publish them. The third one is coming out later this year. I think it's going to be good. And I'm starting to work on the fourth, which I may never finish. But with the process of getting a book published is very tiresome, very time consuming, and very disheartening unless you have the patience and the fortitude to handle rejections or worse yet being ignored, which is what happens oftentimes. Okay, I always take a rejection any day than sending something out in the void and never hearing back from it.
Yeah, no, it's the not knowing that kills us sometimes, having that
Yeah,
silence. I definitely understand.
I just wrote, as a matter of fact, just the day before yesterday, I wrote a letter uh, to a uh, a publication to whom I sent my first novel. And I said, 2 years ago, I never heard from him. And I said, come on, tell me where you are. You're reading it, you're not reading it, you're rejecting it, just so I can cross it out. Because it was very annoying not to be able to have a definition one way or the other. Rejections I can handle. Like everybody who writes should be having a big bag in which you can put the rejection letters because you get many. But just throwing a thing out into the void and never hearing at all, that's very disconcerting. If I were an editor, I would do my best to send rejections or acceptances to everybody as soon as possible.
Mhm.
That's what I think publishers have a duty to do.
Mhm. No, I completely agree. I know, like our magazine, we're not the best at timely responses, but we will always give a response. It'll
I,
happen eventually.
I'll vouch for the fact that I always hear from you. Sometimes, most of the time, it's good, which is pleasure. But every time I know where you stand. So congratulations to you on that.
Yeah, no, we try our hardest. We're not the fastest, but we try. Um, But yeah, no, I definitely understand. I have a few queries and things sent out that it's been so long at this point. I'm just assuming, but then I know in like a month I'll hear back and I'll be like, oh, so you were still thinking about it. Okay. Um, so it's fun
Well,
time.
as I said, it's a matter of, there's some things that you have great desire to get resolution on,
Mhm,
and others you don't really care. But all the time, it's still the same. The appropriate thing is if you can take the time to read somebody's production, you should be able to put out two sentences or use a can response. Even a can response, can rejection is better than nothing.
mhm. No, I completely agree.
Nobody can be so busy that they can write it, send out the rejection letter.
Mhm. Yeah, no, the rejection is hard to swallow, but better no than nothing. That's for sure. Um, Absolutely. So, speaking of acceptances, rejections, all that fun stuff, I have also heard that you recently had your 200th story accepted. It might be higher than that at this point, but
Yeah, right now it stands at 206.
oh, okay. Even
Okay,
better.
I keep
That's
in score because I keep the list. Yes.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Um, how do you kind of keep up the fortitude to send out that many stories? It's impressive to do
Well,
that.
I have look. I was looking at the at our last interview, a playback, and at the time we talked, I had 130. So in the intervening year, I had gotten 70 stories written and accepted, which surprised even me. I didn't realize there had been so much. Why do I have the fortitude? Well, I have to tell you, I enjoy doing it. I'm retired. I have nothing better to do. I don't play golf. I don't play tennis. I hate watching TV. And these days, I don't want to hear politics if I can help it altogether. So I will do what I like. And writing is something that I get great pleasure in coming over. And the idea for the Viennese bonbon is the best example that I can come up with. Coming up with a concept, the germ, which is in this case the music of Beethoven, and saying, what do I do with that if I'm going to write a love story, which I already had decided? And just end up going through the emotions in my mind as to where do I place it and what is going to be the feeling of the story and so on and so forth. It takes an intellectual game to you play with yourself, trying to figure out what can you make the best out of the materials you want. And sometimes the results surprise me. And so I'm writing a story now, as a matter of fact, even as we speak, which I am a three-quarter point, and I don't know how it's going to end. I'm still trying to figure out what makes most sense to end it, and it's not easy. So sometimes, sometimes I start from the end, but those are easy to write because once you know where the story ends, you just have to get there. But the ones that are hardest are the ones like the one writing now, where you know where you started and what you want to do. But yeah, getting to the point of having an end that's satisfying is very hard. But I mean that's the attractive for somebody who likes writing and who likes reading. That is a lot of attractiveness in going through that because it's an intellectual game and you play with yourself.
I love the idea of thinking of it as a game, kind of as even a mystery that you're kind of unfurling as you work through it.
Well, it's not a game, man. I'm being exaggerating. It's a process, but it is a joyful process, frustrating at times, but trying to get something put in the material like a painter, like my daughter paints, and she comes to great painting. And I asked her, well, how do you do it? And she said, I don't know. It just comes to me.
Yeah, no, I have also been asked that question before, and it's hard to answer sometimes. It's like I don't really know all the time. It's
Well,
like,
the why I do it is not difficult. I just told you.
mhm,
The how I do it, it varies depending on what it is I'm writing about.
mhm,
Again, the Viennese bonbon was easy from that viewpoint because I had all the colors in the palette that I wanted to use already to start with. It wasn't a matter of applying them. But some of them are hard.
mhm,
You know,
mhm,
sometimes the trickier ones are the most enjoyable.
mhm. Definitely, definitely. Now, this is just me being curious. Do you work one story through to the end and then do the next one, or do you work on multiple stories at once?
Very seldom I have more than two things at the same time.
Mhm,
Only because the process of getting a story to completion is labor intensive.
mhm,
Uh, sometimes, sometimes I get a story done in a day.
mhm.
Okay, but if it takes longer than that, you have to be thinking about it, agonizing on how to get there. And it is not, it's hard for me to do two things at the same time. I have probably done it once or twice. I remember one case I did it twice because I got stuck in one of the stories and I didn't know what to do with it, so I began writing another. So I was working on both at the same time. But typically, I start from A and move to Z with some intervening detours.
Definitely, definitely. So is that your solution kind of for writer's block? Switch to something else for a little bit and then come back, or do you have different techniques?
Well, I keep on agonizing over it until I get it done. I tried sometimes to write two versions of what could possibly happen and see what works.
Yeah.
But I am a one-track minded person. And once I get into a project, I like to get it done, and preferably to get it done quickly. So I can only remember one time that we already talked about that, in which I was so stuck. I didn't want to give up the story, but I didn't know how to go with it. So I began doing something else, the second story. And
Mhm.
it finally came to me and we could both at the same time, essentially at the same time. But typically that doesn't happen.
Makes sense. That makes sense for sure. Um, so this is a bit of a shift in kind of topic, but once you have a story and you're happy with it, you want to send it out. How do you decide where to send it to? What's your process of looking through magazines and stuff?
By now I know more or less how the magazines that are likely to publish my story, who they are
Mhm,
and what they want. So it was much harder 5, 6, 7 years ago. But the reality is that because they are you can divide fiction into two big categories: general literary fiction on the one hand, and genre fiction. So the genre fiction, I mean fantasy, crime, science fiction, horror, and so on, love stories, and so on. And if you want to have, for example, a horror story, there are a number of magazines that specialize in that. And in fact, many of magazines that is amazing that a majority of the publishers like to write horror stories. I don't know why. But anyhow, so it is, but the more specialized your subject is. For example, alternate history. It's only a handful of publications that will touch that, even consider it. So it's it's self-selection process. If you select what you're going to write about, the genre they are going to be writing about, who to send it to almost writes itself. It almost defines itself. Except if you are in a big category like fantasy, there are many publishers that will take fantasy, and then you try to figure out what kind of fantasy they like better than others. There are some publishers that don't like fairy tales. I haven't written too few fairy tales. I've written some, but not too many. Others want to have dark fantasy and so on. You have to read between the lines, and sometimes they explicitly tell you what it is that they want to get from you. So that's how I decide. Now, a story the Venice Bonbon, it's only good for people like you who like stories that could conceivably be turned into a movie. That tell a story. Okay, there are not too many publishers who like that. So I'm blessed that you have taken my two or three of my stories because I like writing those kind of stories, but not too many people want to publish them. It's just not the kind of thing that they do. Uh, but if on the other hand, if I'm writing, what can I say? If I'm writing a horror story about an abandoned house, then I know there are a bunch of people who are going to be interested in reading it, not necessarily taking it, but there'll be a market for it.
Mhm,
So
mhm,
your market is defined by the type of material you create.
mhm. Definitely, definitely. I know I've had people ask us kind of what our magazine's brand is for the type of stories that we like. And I always struggle to answer because it's very eclectic. But I like the way you defined it. So I might steal your phrasing, that we like stories that can kind of be turned into movies or turned to screen.
Well, I think you like the narrative parts of it. I
Mhm,
can notice that.
mhm,
Try to tell a story that hangs together and it's interesting story you tell, and that could become a screenplay or whatever. So that's what I think of you anytime I write something of that kind, that you will be probably one of the first that I go to because I know that there's a chance that you might be interested in. Not everything I write is of that nature, but much of it is.
mhm, mhm. Well, I am grateful that you think of us. Absolutely. I love reading your writing. We have kind of a handful of authors who I think have realized we love their work, and you're one of them. So we get multiple submissions, and I'm like, I love it. It makes me so happy.
Well, I'll keep on writing as long as I have ideas and as long as I have time and as long as Alzheimer's doesn't catch up with me.
We will be here to read all of them. Um, awesome. So I want to kind of I do want to hint. I know we're focusing on a Viennese bonbon more for this interview, but I do want to hint that you have another story coming out with us in our upcoming issue. The Creatures of Prometheus is what it is titled. Without any spoilers, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Surely, I didn't want because the bonbon is already out or is coming out. I didn't want to steal the thunder talking about it. I wrote the other one, The Creature of Prometheus, because it deals with something that I consider to be a big problem these days. A particular problem for creative people, I mean, which is the interference in your life, on all aspects of life, of robots, artificial intelligence, uh, creations of not of the human mind today. And in connection with that, the story that I write about is of a world in which uh, androids, which are now being manufactured, you can buy. I think the Koreans make some Chinese that even resemble human beings in some of the functions they do and in the appearance. It's very easy to mimic a human as far as the looks. But these androids are coming out with having more and more human-like qualities to the point of potentially achieving self-awareness. In other words, becoming like humans that recognize themselves as they are. They're not just machines, they are intelligent beings. And the conflict that creates. And my story is about the day that's going to happen. Is there going to be a war between the humans and the machines? Who's going to win? Is there going to be a truce, a way to be able to live with each other? And I think those are very important questions that are far from being resolved today, but they needed to be taking into account people at all levels, not only in fiction, in government. They, I like using AI to do research. Okay, I write, I wrote a story that hasn't been published yet about the love life of a praying mantis. Okay, and probably like you, I knew what a praying mantis was, and possibly I knew their love life, but I didn't know the details. So I needed the details to write the story. The details didn't drive the story, but were necessary to make it a believable story. And using AI, I was able in a matter of seconds to come up with a context for the story that make it work. But and here's the big but. When does the AI write the story for me? At what point do I lose my creative control and I'm lazy enough to let the story be written by the AI? And that's the same thing in all aspects of life. We are at a crucial point in history in which, for the first time, humans have a competitor potential of their own creation. And that's what my story is about.
Absolutely. It's so relevant. And like you said, I don't want to take the thunder away from a Viennese bonbon, so we're not going to talk about it anymore. But if our readers want to read the story and find out more, they can in our upcoming issue, issue 8. It will probably be out by the time this interview airs. So go read it, actually.
Okay, and maybe we'll be talking about it next year. Who knows?
Yeah.
But I like the story very much, not because of its literary merit, but because of the quandary was the cause of it that created me. How do you deal with the fact that you have the computers and AI being ubiquitous and being all parts of your life, and you cannot deal with them on your telephone, on your computer, on everything you work on, a workplace, and all of a sudden, are they going to replace us? And are they going? If we are going to have to coexist with them, is that going to be peaceful, or is going to be anxiety driven? I have I take a course in Italian, and I meet with the same people more or less on the same age every Tuesday. And the teacher was giving us a couple of weeks ago a number of AI tools to, for example, do translations and so on. And some of the people went, I cannot even down my phone. This is people, this is getting to be too hard for me. And I sympathize with that. You know, in my lifetime, just to give you an example, I know I use music as an example because I like music. I have gone through, depending on vinyl, to go into 8-track cassettes, reel to reel, little cassettes, CDs, and now all that's gone. People are streaming, and in the course of a few years, the universe has changed completely, and it completely changing the way it's more complex. In the 1920, you put the record on the record player and it plays. Nowadays, just to be able to listen to music, you have to go to an exercise, and you have to be somewhat computer savvy. So it comes through you in all aspects of life, and with the ease and the convenience that having intelligent machines provide, you have the problems of how to deal with them and how you don't lose your identity as humans. That's at the heart of that story, and that's what I wrote and what I think it's an important subject, not necessarily a good story, but an important story.
Absolutely. It is absolutely an important subject, an important question to ask. One that is only going to become more relevant, I think, as time goes on.
It's already relevant, as I said. I am myself pretty guilty of using AI more than I should. But I could read about the mantis going to a book in the library or even doing some other sources. But why don't I go to Gemini and say, Gemini, describe for me how a female mantis deals with a poor husband? And, and it's not pretty. It's not pretty, but you learn it all about it right away. So, and it tends to make you feel to be lazy, and it tends to make you dependent on machines more than you should be. That's another example. I when I was a little kid, we do all our math by hand. Okay. When I went to college, I was using the slide rule, which was a sort of mechanistic way of doing things. And then they had the other, they had the portable the machines. And before that, then you have the laptop, and you don't know what the kids don't do math anymore. They never. Then you put a piece of paper in front of them and make a song. They cannot do it, and we are becoming helplessly slaves to the technology that we create, and that's the problem. That's the thing that I worry about.
Hmm. No,
I'm
absolutely.
sorry, I got on my half horse. I got on my half horse, but this is something that I really people don't think enough. I think they should.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, no, no, I completely agree. Technology is often used in the guise of, oh, make life easier. But some things you should be able to do without the easy part. Some things you should be able to do without that. And also, it doesn't always make life easier. Sometimes it's more complicated.
That's true. That's true.
Yeah.
You know, there was at the time of the war of the Cold War
Mhm.
back in the 50s, there was a great fear of this uh, weapon that was going to unleash a burst of electromagnetic energy that was going to wipe out all forms of technology, all the electrical devices are going to be wiped out. I don't know if it was fantasy or if it's really a weapon that's still in the arsenal. But what happens is all of a sudden all the computers go silent. What are you going to do when you don't cannot necessarily depend on technology? Where are your own skills? Where is your ability to sum, subtract, and multiply by hand? What's your ability to go to a book in the library and read it and write your report based on it? Yeah, you become lazy and you become a slave of your own devices. That's what I'm concerned.
Mhm. No, absolutely. I definitely agree. Um, yeah, I am going to change gears a little bit now. Before I kind of ask my last couple of questions, is there anything specifically you want to talk about that we haven't talked about yet?
No, let's go ahead. If I think of something, I'll tell you.
Okay, great. Um, yeah, so we already kind of checked in and heard about your website. I'm going to be linking that. I'll be linking the book as well. But is there any kind of way you want your readers to connect with you? Is there any way they can shower you with praise about your work?
Well, I have to say I'm not a social butterfly, but I'm really and easily accessible. I have a web page. I'm active on Facebook and Instagram and so on. And I'm always available to talk to anybody about anything. So if you want to get in touch with me to keep praise, please. But criticism, can take it as well. Okay. I said, you have to come to this world with two bags, one to give and one to receive. And so, while I tell my readers and anyone who could do this interview, read or listen to this interview, if you have something that you want to share with the author, I'll be very happy to talk to you and to hear what your comments and reply to them if I can. And I'm sure I draw inspiration to what from the things that people come to me on.
Definitely. And I can also link your social media pages in the bio so people will be able to connect with you if they want to. So they'll just have to scroll down and read and they'll be able to find you in a non-creepy way. Um,
Well, as I said, I want to believe that at this day and age and my age, I can take criticism as well as I can take praise. Probably better because, praise doesn't make me better. The criticism probably does one way or the other. So feel free, I say.
Awesome. And I know I asked you this last time, but I'm curious if your answer will change. Do you have any advice for other authors out there or people who want to get into writing more?
Well, first of all, realize that this is not instant gratification. There is something that you have to work hard at and you have to be prepared to meet failure repeatedly, and the failure doesn't necessarily mean that your work is no good. It means that it might not be good for whatever the editor who reads it thinks he would like to publish. And uh, I have to tell you, I have the number of pages of my list of rejection letters that I keep is about 50 pages single space. Okay, the listing I don't know even how many, but there are very many, uh, many different publications that have rejected my work, and I don't feel bad about it. I mean, I have had my successes too. But the point is that you have to persevere. You have to try to come up with the best possible product that you can. Don't be lazy. Make sure that you really carefully that you try to pare it down. I tell you my rule: use as few adjectives you can get away with, and kill all the adverbs. I never made an adverb that I like because it is a lazy man's word way of doing something. Okay. Anyhow, and read your work 2 or 3 times. Share it with friends if you can to get their opinions. And when you think the baby is ready to be sent to society, just get it out and get it out to as many places as you think could conceivably want to publish it, and then some more. And as I said, usually, typically, the story of mine when I send it out, I end up sending it out to, taking a look at here, 10 to 20 places before I get an acceptance. And so you can, it is labor intensive. It is not something that you just can sit and, it's like watching TV. It's something that you have to put effort into it. And again, be optimistic about yourself and don't be discouraged by failure because it's inevitable.
Absolutely. That's fantastic advice. Thank you so much for that advice. And thank you for talking with me again. It was great getting to reconnect and chat with you.
Well, my pleasure. Do it anytime.
Of
Maybe
course.
next year.